Hi, everyone. Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Marc Powell. He is the co-founder and CEO of Reach Neuro, a neurotechnology startup developing a first-in-class therapy for helping restore movement in people who have had a stroke. Prior to the founding of Reach Neuro, Dr. Powell obtained a BS in biomedical engineering from Georgia Tech and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Brown University. Then he moved to Pittsburgh University, where he worked as a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Neurological Surgery. He also spent some time interning in BME at Draper Lab during the early 2010s. Can you tell us your story? I'd love to hear a bit more about your background.
Hi, Robert. As you mentioned, I did my undergrad work at Georgia Tech, where that's really where I got interested in neuroscience and neuroengineering and kind of learned how the brain and the nervous system is really almost the last frontier of the human body. There's so much that we don't know about the nervous system, and that I think really intrigued me. So I got really interested even as early as my undergrad work at Georgia Tech. And then ultimately that led to my graduate work at Brown. And there I got a really amazing opportunity to work with a team of neuroengineers that was led by David Borton, was my PhD advisor, where we were trying to build brain-machine interfaces. So these are devices that allow us to communicate with the nervous system, whether it's reading signals from the nervous system or writing them to the nervous system. Where I was really focused there on sensory motor integration. So, this idea of how the nervous system takes sensory information from the world and transforms that into an output or a movement. And I was there to work on that, as well as engineering these brain machine interfaces. So, the actual devices that let us communicate with the nervous system. Ultimately, that led to a postdoc at the University of Pittsburgh, where I was helping to run a clinical study. And at that clinical study, we were using spinal cord stimulation to try and help people recover upper limb motor function after they've had a stroke. And so chronic stroke is so prevalent throughout the world, really. There's so many people that have chronic stroke, and it results in permanent chronic deficit in someone's ability to be able to move their body. About 50% of all stroke patients have a disability due to chronic stroke. And when I was at this study, I got the really awesome opportunity to work with some of these individuals and see how spinal stimulation could actually help them recover function, allow them to do things that they couldn't do before. And ultimately that led to the founding team of Reach Neuro deciding to start the company to try and actually bring this therapy to the clinic and start helping patients. And so I was asked to lead Reach full time as its CEO. I left about a year and a half ago from my role at Pitt to run Reach, and that's where we are now. So the Reach is off the ground. We're looking to raise some money right now for running a clinical study using an implantable system that would allow us to do the spinal stimulation. And we're excited where this technology can go.
Yeah, it sounds like it's been a super interesting journey so far, and you've got to work on a few different subsectors within the neurotech space. When did you first get interested in neuroscience?
Yeah, I think my interest in neuroscience really started at Georgia Tech. I had the opportunity to work with a professor there, Stephen Potter, who was at the time doing some really interesting research in growing neurons on dishes that have electrodes built into them. So these are arrays of electrodes that allow us to listen to the small electrical signals that neurons are sending to each other as they're growing in these dishes. And I think there I really saw the complexity of the nervous system and really saw how little we understand about it. And that's what really got me interested, I think, is just sort of seeing it as this unexplored area of science and biology, and being able to be a part of that. You grew up seeing movies like Star Wars, where you have the Luke Skywalker arm and integrating robotics with your nervous system, and that interface, the machine nervous system interface, has always been interesting to me. And been very fortunate to, like you said, be a part of kind of several different aspects of that throughout my academic career, and now ultimately with Reach Neuro. So yeah, it's been a great ride.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned it really is the final frontier. It's really exciting to just be working in a space where it's just so ripe for discovery. Now let's pivot our focus a little bit more to Reach in particular. So could you give us a little bit more detail on the background of Reach Neuro, for example, maybe the timeline or the origins of the journey?
So I think I mentioned earlier that Reach Neuro really came out, or was the conception of Reach really happened as part of a clinical study that I was doing through University of Pittsburgh partnering with Carnegie Mellon University. So I was working there with a really great research team, a bunch of PhD students, as well as some of the professors that were leading the study, who are also co-founders of REACH. So Marco Capogrosso, who's a professor at Pitt in the Department of Neurological Surgery. I was working for him as a postdoc. And then Doug Weber at CMU, who's been in neuroengineering for decades and really knows the space well. I was part of a DARPA program manager. He worked at DARPA as a program manager there in neuroengineering. And then Peter Gersten, who's a neurosurgeon at UPMC, who's actually the one that implants the patients for the clinical study. So we started this clinical study not really knowing if it would work or where it would go, and saw really promising results in the first several patients, and realized that really to bring this technology to actually start helping people in the clinic, we needed a commercial entity to do that. And so that was kind of where the idea of REACH Neuro came from. We founded the company in 2021, so November 2021, and we're working at that point to kind of build the company, build the infrastructure. And then ultimately, in summer of 2022, I left my role at Pitt to run REACH full-time as its CEO, and that's where we are today.
To dive into a little bit more specifics about the device, the product that REACH is building. I believe it's called the Avantis, and I've been reading that it works by stimulating the spinal cord. At this point, generally focused on improving upper limb mobility for those affected by upper limb paralysis after a stroke. And so I've read that one of the innovations of this REACH device is that it targets the sensory neurons and avoids trying to force those motor neurons to fire. And it seems a bit counterintuitive at first glance. And I was just wondering if you could kind of explain to us some of the detail behind what sparked this idea and also just how and why it works.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So as we mentioned, our target is actually not the motor neurons, which are the cells within the spinal cord that actually go and cause muscles to contract. If we stimulated those cells, we'd end up in this regime where we were directly activating muscle contraction with our stimulation. And we would then be responsible for timing and coordinating all of the muscles to move exactly at the right times to create complex movements. This is very similar to what functional electrical stimulation tries to do, where you'd stimulate a muscle and get it to contract. But we realized that the brain is actually really good already at coordinating those movements. In an individual who doesn't have a stroke, signals from the brain pass through a couple different pathways, but primarily the corticospinal tract, which connects motor cortex to the spinal cord, and ultimately to those motor neurons that cause the muscles to move. So our target actually is, so I should take one step back briefly, is that when someone has a stroke and ends up with permanent deficit, it's very highly correlated with damage to that corticospinal tract. So what that means is now there's fewer connections or fewer neurons that are making their way down from the brain to the motor neurons to cause it to move. But it's usually not completely sever that connection. There's usually some neurons that are still there and are still sending some signals. Those signals are just effectively weaker and aren't able to produce the movement they once were. So with our stimulation, when we target the sensory neurons, what's really interesting about the nervous system is that those sensory signals, in addition to going up to the brain so you can feel things in your world, like touching objects, they also connect to the same motor neurons that those the corticospinal tract neurons connect to. And what that means is we have the ability to influence or modulate the motor neurons sort of indirectly by stimulating the sensory neurons. And what's nice about it is that we can stimulate those motor neurons just enough so that they're ready to fire, but not so that we're causing them to fire directly. We're not, like you said, we're not forcing the motor neurons to fire. So we increase their excitability. And that now means that the weaker signal from the brain is enough to cause them to fire action potentials and to cause movement. So in the end, what we're doing is lowering the threshold or priming the nervous system, if you will, to receive these weaker signals, but still leaving the brain up to that role of coordinating the movements. So it's still the brain's job to pick which muscles to move and when to move them. And ultimately, this leads to a really elegant solution where we can stimulate in a sort of open loop fashion where we just have the stimulation on constantly, and then the person is able to, via their own brain control, as if they were moving their limb naturally, be able to perform these complex movements with really coordinated coordinated muscle activity. And so that's kind of the key idea here. And this is founded actually in more than a decade of preclinical work that one of our co-founders, Marco Campogrosso, did as his before he became a professor at Pitt. So there's other research in this space that's looking at spinal cord stimulation to help other types of motor deficits. So specifically, Marco did a lot of work in lower limb movement in spinal cord injury patients. And it's not a direct one-to-one translation to help someone with lower limb function as compared to what we're doing right now or focused on is in upper limb function, but it's similar. And there was reasons to believe from that literature and from the work that Marco had done that this could work in upper limb and it could help people with stroke. And indeed, that turned out to be what happened as a result of the clinical study. So that was really exciting to see.
Yeah, that really is exciting. And as you mentioned, it's such an elegant and innovative solution to really focus on the priming and, upping that excitability and really just letting the brain do what it does best rather than trying to hop in and stimulate at a different part of the process and have to algorithmically figure out that side of things. And so I think you mentioned there was a little bit of work for the lower limbs as well. And I guess this drives me to ask the question, does Reach Neuro have any like head-to-head competitors working on something directly similar to you guys? And if so, what sets your team and technology apart from the competitors? What are some of the key differentiators?
Sure. So there are other groups out there that are looking at spinal stimulation for motor impairments. Onward Medical actually was founded by Marco's postdoc advisor, Gregor Cortine. They're based in the Netherlands, and they're really focused on spinal cord injury patients. So they are focused on lower limb movement for spinal cord injury patients, as well as blood pressure regulation. So they're definitely out there working on this, but our team is the only team to ever demonstrate this kind of spinal stimulation to help with upper limb function and the first to do it in stroke as well. Another kind of, and I should highlight too, kind of one of the key differences from a motor control perspective. In lower limb function, you have these circuits in the spinal cord called central pattern generators that are meant to generate the rhythmic movement of moving your legs as part of walking movement. So it was not obvious that, which in the case of upper limb movement, you don't have that same thing, right? These movements are not rhythmic or they're not patterned in the same way. So it was not obvious that this would work in upper limb, which was pretty exciting. The other aspect, the other kind of way you might look in terms of competition in this space are other companies that are addressing the chronic stroke problem. So there's one company called Microtransponder, which just got FDA approval for their system called Vivastim. And that technology uses vagal nerve stimulation. So this is a nerve that really goes pervasively throughout the body, but they target it in the neck. And by stimulating the vagus nerve in time with movements during rehab, they've shown that patients respond better to that rehab, which is really exciting. And it's really one of the first technologies in this space that's really trying to actually treat chronic deficit from stroke. A lot of the other devices and tools in this space are either adaptive in nature, so they're meant to kind of help a patient work around a deficit, or they're meant to be sort of therapeutic aids where they're like tools that you use in therapy. The microtransponder and the Vivastim system have really started to pioneer this and are first into this market space. How we differentiate ourselves, though, in our case, is that our goal is to help patients directly restore their ability to control their movements. So instead of, stimulating the vagus nerve as a tool to help respond to therapy better, we have what we call an assistive effect. So this immediate effect that when we turn on the stimulation, a patient's able to perform movements that they couldn't do before. And the real reason for that difference is that the stimulation we're delivering is very targeted in nature. So we stimulate the cervical spinal cord in particular, because this is the part of the spinal cord that innervates the muscles of the arm and hand. And we can be really precise with our stimulation. So we can target, say, just elbow flexion or just shoulder abduction. And by selecting which muscles or movements that we're targeting with our stimulation, we can craft a customized program for each patient. And it's that really specific targeting of those specific circuits that allows us to have really strong immediate effects that we've seen in our clinical study.
Thanks for helping us to explore the landscape of these therapies a little bit more. And so to talk a little bit about getting this into the clinic, I saw that Reach Neuro's device has secured a breakthrough from the FDA. And then I also saw that the company had been accepted into the FDA's Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program. Can you talk a little bit about the regulatory bodies and how these programs could potentially help the company get the device to clinic safely and effectively, but also faster?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the US, the FDA is the major regulatory body that kind of regulates the sale and marketing of medical devices like ours. There's a tiered system within the FDA and based on risk. And our device being an implantable device is considered a class 3 device. And as part of that, we're required to get something called a pre-market approval from the FDA. So this is a certain level of burden that the company has to demonstrate both safety and efficacy of the therapy compared to the gold standard. In the case of stroke or chronic stroke, there really is no gold standard. So these are individuals who have tried rehab. Usually they plateaued with rehab at about 3 or 6 months post-stroke. And so now there's really no alternative solutions. So from an efficacy standpoint, one of the things that the FDA has realized is that there's a strong need to bring technologies to the market that can help this population. So one of the requirements for becoming part of the breakthrough designation or the breakthrough device designation is demonstrating that your technology has the potential, at least, to have a significant impact to a disorder with such a wide-ranging impact as chronic stroke. So the first step in this was getting breakthrough device designation. FDA acknowledged that. They kind of agreed with our argument that Reach's technology has that potential, and that led them to give us a breakthrough designation. And then for breakthrough devices, they just started about a year ago now, this TAP program that you mentioned. And what that program is meant to be is an advisory program for the FDA to help early stage startup companies like ours get all the way through the development cycle and then ultimately bring it to market. And I think one of the really nice things that both programs, both the breakthrough designation program as well as the TAP program, show is that FDA is really working hard to make the process still rigorous. That's a key aspect of what the FDA needs to do, but make it a bit easier or help companies navigate the process of getting FDA approval for their devices more easily. So it's really great to be able to partner with the FDA on both of these programs. Effectively, what they mean for us is that our interactions with the FDA are a bit accelerated. So they respond to certain requests a bit faster. And the TAP program in particular is an advisory program. So we get assigned an employee of the FDA called our TAP advisor, as well as an FDA regulator who's assigned to our company. And they work with us to engage the FDA's broader network. So they let us talk to different stakeholders, whether it's private or payers or Medicare, for example, when it comes to reimbursement, or providers like neurologists, or patients even, really whoever we need to be able to answer questions that we have. The FDA is there to actually help us engage those stakeholders, learn what we need to learn. And the nice thing too is that the FDA gets to be there and they get to see the feedback that we get back. So in the end, there's really not a surprise. When we submit things to the FDA, they're not surprised with what's inside. And we have a good idea, hopefully, that the FDA will approve of those and like the path that we're going down. So like I mentioned, this is really a great example of the FDA putting a lot of effort in to trying to make the FDA process, which can be pretty long and expensive, as efficient as possible for early stage startups like ours.
Yeah, having those communication lines open, as you mentioned, could never be a bad thing, just because, they know what to expect from your team, you know what they're looking for. I'm also just happy to hear that they are putting in an effort to really keep things rigorous, but also try and help these sorts of processes go faster, for example. Another question that I had was, I saw a picture of a patient using the Reach Neuro device, and I noticed that they were wearing EMG sensors on their upper limb while they were using this device. And so I was wondering, were these mainly used as research tools, or will the option to collect that EMG data and other data as well also be included in the final product?
Yeah, so the picture you saw, those were primarily used as a research tool. So as part of the clinical study, we do measure muscle activity to be able to see what's happening from a physiological standpoint when we're stimulating the spinal cord. One of the things we noticed by recording that muscle activity is that when stimulation is turned on and a patient intends to make a movement, so they actually think about doing a movement, the EMG activity actually increases, which kind of goes to why we're seeing these improvements in range of motion, and muscle strength is another area. So that's primarily what we're using those tools for. But one really nice thing about what we're doing with movement specifically, as opposed to potentially other indications for spinal stimulation. Like spinal cord stimulation is used to treat chronic pain today. But the nice thing about doing this with motor disorder is that we can actually directly measure the effects of our stimulation via EMG. We have objective quantitative measures that we can directly see, and that has made it a lot easier to develop the programming process that we go through to figure out what sort of stimulation settings we use to help patients best. So we can leverage that feedback that we're getting as part of the clinical study through these EMG sensors to be able to create these programming processes more.
What is next for Reach Neuro? After going through the FDA clearance process, even with this breakthrough designation, it's definitely not a short process. And is Reach looking to potentially build another device or platform, or is the focus more on perhaps optimizing the current platform?
Yeah, so a little bit of both. I think, one really interesting aspect of this is that, we're starting with stroke, but there's a potential for this to help in other indications as well. So traumatic brain injury, for example, cerebral palsy, spinal cord injury, like we talked about earlier. So there are other disorders that cause motor effects that are a result of damage to the connection between the brain and the spine, or even potentially the spine to the muscles, that we may be able to help with our therapy. So that's one area that we'd look to expand into. Another aspect of what we're building, and I kind of touched on it, is that one of the key innovations that we're building is how we actually program this for each individual patient. That process, we need to kind of find a custom program or targeted program for each patient. And so we're building actually algorithms to do that process in an optimized way, or in even an automated way. And so one of the ways that we can optimize this moving forward is by using tools like machine learning to take those objective measures that I mentioned as well, the outputs of our stimulation, feed them into these machine learning algorithms to be able to more effectively create the motor effects that we're looking for. So you can imagine a day maybe in the future where patient comes in, and instead of spending time trying to program and try different things out, there's a button that says, program this, and it sets all the parameters for that patient automatically and quickly in the most optimal way. So we're not quite there yet, but that's definitely an area that moving forward we could expand into and continue to develop with the technology.
And are you open to sharing a little bit more detail about these algorithms you mentioned? What would be some of the key signals that could feed into them? Do you have any certain type of machine learning that you have in mind that might be the best fit for an algorithm like this?
Yeah, so I can't talk too much about it. Those are proprietary, but effectively the goal is to, I guess the best way I can explain it is that the cervical spine is really well organized in terms of anatomically organized. So I can stimulate on a particular electrode that we have implanted and get a very specific output, say shoulder movement. And a different electrode might affect elbow flexion or elbow extension. So the challenge that we're faced when we have to program these is, what stimulation parameters, so what current do we deliver, what frequency do we deliver that current at, and which electrodes we stimulate on. And we need to balance that between, say, 3 or 4 different electrodes simultaneously. And that's a non-trivial task, right? You're having this very multi-dimensional effect on the arm where you're trying to target multiple joints simultaneously. And finding the right balance of the different stimulation parameters is the tricky part. So the algorithms that we're developing are meant to figure out which electrodes we want to stimulate on, and how we stimulate. What are the parameters we use to stimulate to get the correct output for that particular patient? So we're looking at outputs like, the movements they're performing, for example, and how smooth they are, what are their muscle strength, that kind of thing. And we can use those data to feed back into these algorithms. And over time, we can look at this over many, many, many patients who are using the device, and actually use those data in aggregate to even improve that further.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you can definitely see the algorithms getting quite complex as you have high dimensional amounts of inputs and high dimensional amounts of outputs. And that's really cool how you're able to start to aggregate it as well. And what advice would you give to students or young professionals that are aiming to work in the field of neurotech, potentially either from an engineering standpoint that probably aligns closer to the background of you and I, or maybe somebody that wants to approach this from a clinical side, or maybe even work in like a business development side? Do you have any tips for those looking to get involved in the space?
Yeah, I think number one is do it. I love this space, and I think your background as well highlights that you're interested in this. And as you know, there's just so much to do. There's so much to learn in this space. So I think number one is look for people who are in this space already. Reach out to them. If you're a student, I think academic research is the core of what we're doing, and there's so much going on at universities that has yet to be spun out into industry, whether it's because it's so cutting edge that we just don't know enough to make it into a product, or it just hasn't, had the opportunity to become a product. So there's a ton of opportunity in the academic space, the academic research space, but there's also a lot of interest right now in neuroengineering as an industry. I think, there are companies like Neuralink, for example, that I think the publicity that Elon Musk has brought to the field through Neuralink, regardless of kind of what you think about the company as a whole, has done a lot to bring the public attention onto this space. So now the time is right to really get involved and reach out to the companies that you're interested in or the professors you're interested in working with and do that. The other thing I'll mention too is that, there's a big challenge or a perceived challenge in transitioning from the academic world into industry in the form of startups like Reach. I know, I think by its very nature, neuroengineering is a translational field. There are so many people that I've worked with through my academic career who I know would love to start a company, who love the idea of translating their technology to the clinic. And we're right on the cusp of that in neuroengineering in so many places that it's just a very common interest for students. And what I'll say is that, it's a big jump to go from academia to a startup, but it is something that can be done, by anybody who wants to, right? I really, really encourage people to go through that. And I keep learning every single day as I go through this. It has been a learning process, but it's something that I really believe academic founders or scientific founders are some of the best founders for these spin out companies, because they know the technology by heart and they can see how their technology fits within the broader scope of the space. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, I also encourage you to take that leap and to try it. And right now, I think really is the time.
Yeah, it really is an exciting time for the space. As you mentioned, there's a lot of publicity that has recently come to the space of neurotech, and I think that's good because it's getting more and more people interested in and excited about it, and more people working in the space. That's bound to create new innovations. And I'm also really excited to see some of these things that you mentioned that, for now are just in the labs, but are probably very soon going to start to get translated out into companies and perhaps eventually into patients as well. And so, speaking a bit about the future of neurotech, I was wondering, do you have any predictions for the field over the next perhaps 20 years or so? What's your vision for neurotech over the long term? And, this could be specifically zoomed in to the specific subset of the field that you're working in right now, or it could be zoomed out to just the field at large, or even ideally, if you could talk about both.
Sure. Yeah, so I think one of the things that drew me to this space in particular, so using spinal stimulation to help people with chronic stroke, is that we're using technologies, we're using hardware that's out there already to a large degree. So spinal stimulation has been used since the 80s to treat chronic pain. And what I really like about where Reach is headed right now is that we're able to translate these technologies that there's not a lot of risk involved in the hardware that we're building, right? It's really focused on this algorithm side of things and optimizing it for different patients. And so as sort of as a very next step, as an early next step, I think Reach is really in that sweet spot of being able to use existing technologies in these new ways that now we've learned how to use them via the research that we've been doing, and start to help patients in the very near term. That said, I think there's, like you mentioned, in the long-term future, 20, 30 years from now, that this space will continue to grow. And one of the things that I worked on in my graduate work was trying to increase the number of electrodes that we're using to interact with the nervous system, the bandwidth of data we're able to either read from or write to the nervous system. And I think, that's one of the main goals of lots of companies out there, whether it's Neuralink, Paradromics, Synchron, all of these different companies are trying to make the fidelity of the information that we're communicating with the nervous system better. And that will ultimately lead to a lot of possibilities. I think the medical applications, in my mind, are the ones we should focus on first. So helping people who have different disabilities or neurological disorders, but more broadly, I think it could really become an integral part of how we treat these kinds of disorders. So I think there's a lot of potential for this space. I think that we're, far away from being able to sort of read anyone's mind. I don't think that's really the focus at the moment, but I do think that we have the ability to help patch or repair deficits that may be there because of certain disorders or diseases. And that's really going to be where we can bring this technology to the forefront as best as possible. Sure, yeah. So you can reach us at the email address reachus@reachneuro.com. You can also see that on our website, www.reachneuro.com. Feel free to email there. I'd love to talk to people who are interested in this space, but also people who are stroke patients or family of stroke patients who are interested in learning more about the technology. We will have clinical trials around the corner, and happy to communicate with those individuals. We're always interested in learning what challenges they face in day-to-day life and how we can best serve that population. So happy to talk to anybody who's willing to. Either of those channels work well.